during President Trump's first term in office, he wanted to achieve a nuclear arms control agreement. He wasn't able to succeed. Do you think he'll try this again?
It's very interesting to me that even when Trump was a real estate developer back in the 80s in New York, he was interested in nuclear arms control.
And we're live today. Welcome, listeners. It truly is a proud moment for me. I feel very honored to have a very special guest today, a Rose Gottemoeller, and all things I think should. What's that? What do you say when you say, "Oh, I have to be very honest and open here"? What's that term? I forget what that term is. I have to admit that Rose is actually my second cousin, my mom's first cousin, and so she's family. And but Rose also is really an amazing lady, and I'm very excited to have her today. So welcome, Rose.
Thank you, Greg. It's great to be here.
And Rose is plenty busy these days because of her work. And I'm going to let her just start off and give listeners, because I want to make sure I don't fumble over all the wonderful achievements and her continuing work that she's been doing. So Rose, go ahead and just tell listeners a little bit about, share a little bit about yourself.
Okay, great. And again, thank you, Greg, for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let's see where to start. I spent most of my life living and working on issues to do with nuclear policy. The Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, their big buildup in the 1970s and 80s, our concerns about how to keep it under control and keep it limited, while we, of course, needed to maintain our own nuclear forces and capabilities and ensure that there was some parity or equality with Soviets, who for a while looked like they were really trying to rush and build up to have a superior force to ours. But we managed to control that over many, many years. And mostly I was working in the think tank world. In the 1980s, I worked for Rand Corporation, but then I had the honor of going to work for President Clinton in the 1990s. And during that time, we were working on trying to protect the former Soviet arsenal from terrorists and from the wrong people getting their hands on those nuclear weapons. Because if you remember, Soviet Union fell apart in 1990, 1991, and they had thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons and a lot of nuclear material that could make more nuclear weapons scattered around the country. So the United States, working very closely with them, they were broke at that time, and there was a lot of instability and a lot of temptation to sell stuff to the highest bidder, including to terrorists, that we went in and worked with them to build better fences around their facilities and make sure they were accounting for every single warhead. It was a big project, and it was continued with President Bush, particularly after 9/11. That became super important work because we were afraid of terrorists getting their hands on nuclear material and nuclear warheads out of Russia. So that work went on for a good long time. And then when I went to work for President Obama in 2009, he asked me to be the negotiator of the strategic arms reduction treaty we have with the Russians still. We call it the New START Treaty. And it brings the number of nuclear warheads that we deploy on each side down to 1,550. Just by comparison, in 1994, the United States and Russia had each about 12,000 warheads operationally deployed. And so under the first Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, we brought those numbers down by half to 6,000 on each side. And now, after some additional treaties that were negotiated, we are down to 1,550. So that was a big job, and I really was glad we were able to accomplish it. It's hard to think about because we have such a rotten relationship with the Russians right now. But at the time, we could make some good progress. After I worked at that job, I was invited to apply for the job of the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, which is the number 2 job at NATO, and I was accepted by the then Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, a Norwegian guy who just left the job a short time ago, actually, but he was my boss for 3 years from the period of 2016 through 2019. And it was during that period that President Trump was first in office. So it was really interesting. A lot of people know that he doesn't like NATO very much, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
And he was really tough on the allies. We can talk about that some more, but it was really interesting to watch him operate at NATO, and he was super effective at getting the allies to sit up and pay attention and start to spend more money on their own defense. So that's what I did during that period. And since my husband Ray and I left Brussels at the end of 2019, we've landed back in California, where my husband grew up in the Bay Area. We live now in a town called Mountain View, down south of San Francisco, and have a son and daughter-in-law and two grandsons here, and another son and daughter-in-law living in the Washington, D.C. area. So we've been really blessed with where we've landed and with what our kids are doing. So that's a short thumbnail sketch, and
Okay.
really, again, glad to be with you today, Greg.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rose. This is, obviously, listeners, you can tell I got quite a guest today, and it's almost, it's both exciting, exhilarating, and I don't know where to start, but I'm going to settle down into, Imagine Fitting In is all about mentors, healthy lives, and community. And, I just want to say thank you again for myself, and I'm assuming all my listeners, for all your work to date. And I know you're still making efforts and are active in the world because of all your expertise and experience. And I think that, it's in terms of how critically important it is to mentoring, and if you're not being mentored, then once, mentoring others and passing it forward. So, as I mentioned to you, the podcast Imagine Fitting In is just about healthy lives all around, and trying to encourage people to realize the importance of mentors, how powerful they are in our communities. And because I know I've been blessed with them, and I continue to find those people that sometimes I don't even realize I'm being mentored. And sometimes I catch one, I go, okay, I'm going to spend some time with this person, because there's nuggets there. There's some definitely nuggets. And that's my purpose of my podcast. So maybe this conversation to instill and inspire young lives, old lives, everybody, to maybe something they may hear today may inspire them to say, yes, I'm going to go for it. Or, kind of shake them up a little bit and take a look at what they're doing. I know that giving back and having purpose is what is going to be running my rest of my life. So again, and I usually go back and we'll start because, she lives out in San Francisco, but my cousin Rose is out from Ohio. She's a good old Buckeye. So tell us about where you were born. You told us about where you call home today, but where were you born, and what was family like, and your family there and your parents?
Sure. My father was Ben Gottemoeller, and my mother was Edna Gottemoeller. They had a house in Columbus, Ohio. My dad worked for the Nationwide Insurance Company. And Ben and Edna had 6 kids. There's still 5 of us on this earth. I'm happy to say we're still really, really close. We've got a good group of cousins in that generation. Everybody loves to get together for our own family reunions. Every other year, we're going to be up in Michigan this summer for a family reunion at a lake in Michigan. So it's really great. But my parents, both of them, my mom had grown up in Sydney, Ohio, and my dad on the Gottemoeller family farm in Mercer County. So Columbus and the experience of living in Columbus was I think something new for both of them in many ways, big city life, so to say. But they really pushed us kids to learn and to work hard, and to, once we got to the age when we could have a job, always have a job in the summer or whenever we had some free time. My brothers all, of course, delivered papers. People will remember delivering papers on cold winter nights, cold winter mornings. I'm sure about that.
Yes.
But my parents had those really, I think, solid values, and they pushed us really hard. And that was a good thing. We all ended up having good lives and good chances with our own kids and spouses to raise the next generation up. People often ask me how I got interested in things Russian. It's so
Right.
funny. You guys might remember the Sputnik launch, some of you, in 1957, the first Earth satellite that went up that the Soviets launched. And my dad was fascinated by it. I remember as a little kid, must have been about 4 years old. He
Hmm.
took me out on the front lawn and pointed up. There was this little tiny spark of light moving across the sky. He said, "Look, that's not a star.
There it
That's a
is.
satellite that the Russians put up. That's Sputnik." And it's so funny. People say, "Is that how you got interested in Russia?" Well, I always dated back to that time because, again, my dad was always pushing us to reach for the stars, so to say. But
Sure.
it did lead, as I think many know, to a space race in the 1960s and 70s, a race to get to the moon. And the U.S. government was pouring a lot of money into STEM, what we now call STEM,
Right.
education, science and tech, math, etc. But they also put money into Russian language studies at high schools around the country. And my high school in Columbus, Ohio, Upper Arlington High School, had a really good Russian program. And that's how I started to learn Russian. So I do take it as an important moment when Dad took me out on the front lawn that night in Columbus, Ohio.
Wow. Like, so leading up to that, like, did you have any idea what you wanted to do when you were a kid? But does that memory, is that a standout memory from me when you're young to go, you just fascinated you? Obviously in space, you know?
Right, right. Well, I was fascinated. And then, the space race was fascinating. I was just thinking about it. We used to have somebody bring a black and white portable TV to my third grade classroom so we could watch John Glenn go up. And, it
Mm,
was super exciting. It was one of the most exciting things out there. And oh, by the way, we got to stop lessons for a while and watch TV in the classroom.
right.
So that
Right.
was that was memory inducing. But also, I do think that I got interested during that period of competition. And at the time when I was studying Russian in high school, I didn't think I was going to do anything actually technical with it. I was always interested in space and science, but I wanted to be an interpreter at the United Nations. I thought that would just be the coolest thing.
Right.
And then when I got to college, I majored in Russian at Georgetown University, and I quickly discovered two things. I quickly discovered my Russian was never going to be good enough to compete with professional and native Russian speakers. I was never going to get to that level. That was number one. And number two, I decided I didn't want to be up in the interpreter's booth up above. I wanted to be down on the conference floor
In the
in
in
the
the mi-
UN
in the
General
mix.
Assembly or wherever. I wanted to be actually working on the policy rather than, and interpreting is a really worthy profession. And I so admire the people who are good at it. I wasn't going to be good at it. And I also decided I'd like the policy aspect.
Uh-huh. So you definitely wanted to be in the mix. That's really wonderful. Now you mentioned the school you attended, was that high school,
Yeah, Upper Arlington High School.
Upper Arlington? Rose, I always ask everybody, were there any teachers, in high school that stood out to you that made an impression or kind of helped steer you?
Oh, I had a couple of really good ones, but since I was so crazy about learning languages, I was studying both French and Russian in high school. I really was a language buff. I really liked it a lot. And my Russian teacher, Shirley Wooten, taught me for 3 years. And I still remember her well. She died not so very long ago, living still in the Columbus area.
Mm,
But she was a real inspiration and I would say, got me launched on parts of my career that I'm really proud of. Because for me, Russian language has always been a good tool to have. Like when I was negotiating with the Russians, I could listen to their quiet conversations where they thought they were keeping a secret from me, but I understood what they were saying, and that's valuable for a negotiator to know what the other side's thinking.
right. Don't tell them now, but she actually understands a few things. That's almost secret agent like.
I
That's
wouldn't call it
that's
that glamorous, but
I
still.
know I know that's my Jankowski humor coming out. Um, okay, so definitely influenced you in language and stuff. And so, like in your teens and your 20s, where'd you end up? Where was your focus when your teens and your 20s? Like, did you find yourself on a set mission, or you had this general idea like, okay, I'm going to go this direction, and you had your eyes set on something, or all of a sudden opportunity created up other things?
Yeah, well, like I said, I thought I wanted to be a UN interpreter, but I always thought I wanted to use language in my future profession. I wasn't sure whether it was going to be Russian or French. I liked studying both of them. And then you were talking about mentors. I wanted to mention one of my early mentors. Uh, while I was still a senior at Upper Arlington High School, believe it or not, the Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio, which is close to Upper Arlington, very right in the middle of OSU campus, Ohio State campus,
Mm-hmm.
they started looking around for people who could read Cyrillic, who could read the Russian language, because they were starting a big Air Force project to establish a kind of early index, a computerized index of Soviet scientific journals. They were trying to discover what the Russian Soviets were up to in terms of technology development. So it was a simple job. It was to basically, we call it transliterate the Cyrillic alphabet into the English alphabet and then fill in some forms that would then go to the punchers. Remember old punch cards for computers?
Sure, sure.
And then they would get uploaded into these big, huge mainframes. Well, my boss during that period was a guy named David Judy, and he was a really good mentor to all of us young people who were working there. Some were already at OSU studying Russian. Some of us were in high school studying Russian. And he was a good mentor for all of us, and I think gave us all a good idea of what the professional possibilities could be. But what was most interesting, I love telling the story, is one day he said to me, "Hey, you want to go look at the big mainframes?" Well, I didn't know much about computers in those days. It was 1970, you know? So
Yeah.
I said, "Well, sure." We had to dress up in white coats, put a, hat on your head, white hat, had to put booties on. Everything had to be, it was like it was going into a clean room. So we walk in and there are these giant mainframes buzzing away. And he said to me, "You know what? Within a decade, all of this computing power you see here is going to be on your desktop." And I said to him, "No way is that going to happen." And 10 years later, so that
Yes.
was 1970, 1980, I was working at the RAND Corporation and I got my first desktop computer. And
And
I
like,
thought back, David, Judy, you were right. So
oh
he
my
not only,
gosh,
he was a great mentor, but also, like I said, he pushed us to think about the future. And that
hmm
was, for me, that was a really strong lesson about what mentorship can be about.
that's fabulous. I have to mention because back in the 60s, we lived here in Dayton, Ohio, and my dad, A. Ivan Jankowski, he spent a number of years and he was in the Army and he worked on some of the first helicopters.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
then it was at UD and they were doing a lot of research and work out here. And he ended up, some of others work, he worked on the ejector seats for fighter jets
Oh,
because
wow.
the ejector seats were breaking the pilots' backs. So
Right.
they were literally using cadaver spines and like seeing how what compression loads they can handle. He worked on repairing black box flight recorders in the Southeast while he's in the Army in the late 50s, early 60s. Um, Hence, my older brother Gary was born in North Carolina. We came up to Ohio, and my father was actually he worked for a contractor for the University of California, Irvine,
Oh,
and he did work. Um, but before that, in his time at the base, I can't remember if it was University of California, Irvine, or for a later contract, but he actually worked on the space program,
oh,
and
wow.
he has this photograph. It just says technician, but it's my father in a white lab coat standing in front of one of those massive mainframe computers with an astronaut in the background being shaken, and he's just a blur. And they're testing to see how much tolerance, right? The brain can handle and all that kind of thing.
Wow.
So that was published in the Saturday Evening Post in 1967.
There you go. It's very close to the same time period. What do you know? That is cool.
Exactly. So he had huge contribution to the air and space efforts all through his career. But I just had to mention that, and it's just a really proud moment for me to share that. Even though it just says technician at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, that's my dad with a crew cut, and he was in the mix. So that's
Absolutely. That's really cool.
so you're getting yeah. It's real. I was going to mention comment about the high school and when because I went to John H. Patterson Cooperative in Dayton, Ohio here, and it was a
Uh-huh.
vocational school. and they gave you opportunities to get out in the field, meet people and just to be thrown in. And all of a sudden you're in a work environment in your field and you're amongst all these people that you're part of a team. And
Right.
and I didn't realize this till now, that every single person I interacted with, that was a mentor, because I was being plopped in early. I was still going to high school, but I'm here, this
Right.
student kind of learn the ropes of like what it means to be, on time, responsible, do your job and that kind of thing.
Put
And
your
it was,
time card.
yeah. And it made you feel proud. It made you feel like an adult and that you were being recognized, as a teenager. And usually a teenager, people, they're stressed out and they're not, in terms of not having that link from high school to like a buffer into the operating world. So it's
Right.
just super powerful. And obviously, you are a shining example. I like to think that I'm a shining example, that I benefited from it, that it helped me, because I as a teenager, I was struggling with the same things that typical teenagers today struggle with, but it's just a different time. It's the same thing where, I believe wholeheartedly, Rose, that the lack of identity and purpose, you can create stress on yourself. And you see now the way technology has come, we have so much coming at us every day. It's the reason why I left advertising, because at 28, I had epiphany,
Uh-huh.
that I realized that I was using all my creative energies to use propaganda, my creative energies to sell pharmaceutical drugs, really bad food, alcohol, cigarettes, everything I didn't align to myself with. And I finally just had an epiphany, like, what do I want to be remembered for? Am I a contributor, or am I just, I don't know. It's not typical 28-year-old asking themselves, what do you want to put on your gravestone? What do
Yep.
you want to be remembered for? That's not typical 28-year-old. Well, I
Yep.
don't
Yep.
know
Yep.
how I came to that. So I don't know if you call me an old soul or whatever, but I shifted to the fitness career and I left that. So now you're in your teens, in your 20s. So you head to, you mentioned Georgetown University.
I did, yeah. And I just wanted to say, I think it was important. Everything my folks did, and then as I said, my boss at Battelle, everything they did was to really push me to think about the opportunities of the future, and that the world had many options in it, and I didn't have to choose one thing particularly. And indeed, I may switch at some point, but to
Right.
think about what the future could hold in a positive way and an optimistic way. And it sounds like your folks did the same, that you could have that epiphany at 28 and make a big life change, but do it in a, straightforward way. So
It,
I think
it
that's
was
really great.
it was interesting because I tell people that before I went to John H. Patterson that, I'm 14 years old and I'm deciding that I want to be an art director. I'm going to decide at 14 years old that, yeah, I think that's the path, have a vision,
Yeah.
right? Um, and needless to say, 14 years later, I have this epiphany that I kind of went through that path, kept me
Right.
structure. I was employed and all that, blah, blah, blah. And then I just, I don't know when that goes off, of sometimes because people changing careers.
Yep.
I know personally that I've never been so fulfilled in my career, in my life. Life is not easy. There's ups and downs and struggles, and that you can't really enjoy the good times without the struggles and the bad times. And
Right.
it's a peaks and valleys, as God bless my Aunt Rosie, I'll never forget it. She's like, life is just peaks and valleys. And it was just a simple comment, but it stuck. And to me, there's such a level of appreciation when you said that your parents, they allowed you to envision a potential.
Right.
And I think that's so key. I've never had children, but I think it's so key to try to see the little shining glimmers of light in the children, try to nurture them, keep them on the straight and narrow, give them structure. It may change, but
And it's also so important what you had to say about your Aunt Rosa and her advice, because I always say to my kids, life's going to shake you up. It's not always straight up, and there will be some tough times, and heaven forbid you have to deal with a true tragedy, but definitely
right.
tough times. And you have to be able to see through that, yeah, you may be in a valley for a while, but you can start climbing out of it. and it
Mm-hmm.
sometimes takes a while. But that that potential to move from the dark to the light, I think, is really important.
Right. So were there any significant like life-changing experiences, like if Georgetown, anything that was like goes, okay, I'm all in. I know exactly where I'm going to fit in.
Well, it's interesting. This is kind of a big, gigantic geopolitical development. But if you remember in the early 1970s, President Nixon made his enormous decision to open up to China. He went to Peking. He met with Mao Zedong. Had this big opening to China, which China was completely closed book for us. Well, that also was accompanied by an opening to the USSR and to Brezhnev, the Communist Party leader, and the other people there. And, Nixon and Kissinger, who was his national security advisor, were pretty clever about trying to play both sides against each other, the Russians and
Mm.
the Chinese against each other. And so they also had a big opening with the USSR and created what was called the first détente during that period.
I remember that.
Uh, yeah, and the one thing that excited me, well, there were a couple of things that excited me. First, it was going to lead to some big space cooperation, and there was a big space project that was accomplished in 1975 to bring together the Apollo launch vehicle that had taken us to the moon already at that point, and their Soyuz rocket, and to have them meet up in space and do a rendezvous. Because the
Oh
idea
wow.
was, the basic purpose of that project was, if one of our astronauts or one of their cosmonauts got stranded in space, the other side could go up with their rocket and help to rescue them and get them back down again. So it had a practical purpose, but it was a big deal. Can you imagine bringing the two big competitors in the race to the moon? Yeah, they lost, we won. But bringing them together within a few short years for a project of that kind, that was a big deal. And for me, it was like, wow, this has some real potential for future cooperation. And then
Right.
the other thing that I really became interested in was the first strategic arms limitation agreement that was reached in 1972, when for the first time we agreed to try to limit our nuclear weapons, limit their nuclear weapons in an equal way, both with the same responsibilities and commitments. So
Right.
completely reciprocal. But it's the first time we managed to agree to try to limit our nuclear weapons. So that too was a big deal. So that happened in 1972.
Okay. And so that was now. How old were you in '72? Were you at Georgetown or
Yeah, I was 20 years old in 1972, and I was a junior at Georgetown at that point.
okay? And so, yeah, I have to say, I just have to comment because I don't know. I'm not going to use the word crazy, but I mean, I love the fact that you're mentioning like the almost the genius of like putting them two together, us engaging with them, and then all of a sudden like, oh yeah, and we're gonna go up in space, and that's where we'll negotiate and be civil. It's like we have to go all the way up there. It's kind of I don't know if the word's ironic or nuts or crazy. Like why
Yeah,
we're it, you know what I'm saying? Like the average person, you're like, oh, we can talk if we go up to space.
right. That's such a funny remark, Greg, because even today, we have such a bad bilateral relationship with Moscow right now, because Putin invaded Ukraine, and this huge
Right.
war of aggression is going on in Ukraine. But the one place we do continue to cooperate is on the International Space Station. And Russians and Americans are up on the International Space Station right this minute, and they are continuing to cooperate, even though we can't talk to each other on the ground. So you are very, very right in your comment.
I mean, it's just a simple observation of like, okay, does anybody else see this? And it's like, can we just all get along? But, you know, the world is a big, crazy place.
Doesn't
Uh,
work on Earth so well.
right? Um, so wow. Okay, so, you know, all right, I'm gonna try to I did a little research. Okay. So when you're the Deputy Secretary General NATO during President Trump's first in his office, was really critical of the alliance. and
Yeah,
as you
absolutely.
mentioned, and including threatening to withdraw from NATO.
Yep.
Now now how that come up? I mean, what that result in? What was your take on it? And do you think he'll do anything toward a second term?
Yeah, well, President Trump was really frustrated with the Allies. You know, he prides himself on being a good businessman, and he really thought the Allies were freeloading, that they were allowing us to pay the big bills for military expenditure, for defense equipment, capabilities of all kinds, and they were not living up to their commitment that they had made to spend 2% of their gross domestic product, GDP, on defense. When Trump first came to NATO in May of 2017, only 3 out of 27 allies at that time were at 2% of GDP or above, and the United States was one of those 3. So he was really angry when he came to NATO on that occasion. I do want to point out an historical fact, though, is that every single president from whatever party since the very early days of the alliance was frustrated about free riding by the European allies. There's a great, if you want to look into it, there's a great report of a National Security Council meeting in 1963 that Jack Kennedy was chairing. And he quotes him saying, I am sick and tired of these free riding, freeloading allies. We got to get them to pay more for their own defense. But the good thing about Trump is that he scared the living daylights out of the allies in that first term in office. And they did he started a momentum of them spending more on their own defense and recognizing that they really had to take more responsibility for their own defense. And both my boss, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, and we both thought that was a good thing because they had not been living up to their promise to spend 2% of GDP on defense. So that was the first term in office, and yeah, he threatened quite explicitly on a couple of occasions to take the United States out of the alliance. Now, looking forward to the second Trump administration, do I think he's going to do that? Well, if you can say anything about Mr. Trump, he's hard to predict. He's quite unpredictable, but I will say he's going to find a much different NATO from the one he found in when he first came in 2017. Nowadays, 22 out of 32 allies are at 2% of GDP or above. You know, Putin's invasion of Ukraine was the second phase of this upswing in defense spending. Putin scared the living daylights out of them, too,
Right.
and made them realize that they have to be ready to defend themselves and that, you know, the United States will be there as an ally, but, you know, they have to carry some responsibility, too. And so there's been a huge upswing in defense spending in Europe. And I think Mr. Trump can take some satisfaction that he started the ball rolling in his first administration. Putin gave it an added boost, but now the allies are in a much, much different place. And I think that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I will just tell you from a perspective of just general knowledge, that is not a fact that you mentioned that how frustrated all the presidents, even back to Kennedy, I think most people had no idea, or it was a fact that just wasn't in the headlines or at all. You know, obviously, today in today's age, every single thing that can be a headline or can be talked about is put out somewhere. So, I mean, that's great, and it's like, I guess, you know, there's a great thing about being able to negotiate and hold your ground, and
Right.
that gives me it almost warms my heart a little bit knowing that, okay, you're there, and it's like, okay, because we don't, sometimes when you don't understand how things are going down, you don't know the whole story, and that, oh my gosh, how true is that for everything in life, you know, when you
Right.
just make a judgment call. But now we're getting educated, and in this insight, this is inspiring. Yeah, it's both inspiring and then also like, whoa, okay, then Putin comes in and he's showing that mark where it's like, okay, he's kind of supporting the whole push. So it's kind of like an ironic kind of trifecta of getting
Yep.
people to move. It's
It's
crazy to try to put your head around.
it sure is ironic because you know, Putin wanted less NATO in Europe, and he definitely didn't want Ukraine to join NATO, but instead he got more more NATO in Europe because Finland and Sweden, two longtime neutral countries, decided once he invaded Ukraine, they said, we want to be in NATO as soon as
Right. We're
possible.
in.
And they're both, very, very good contributors to defense. They have really good armies, and they are really good about their defense budgets. So frankly, NATO, there were some ups and downs in getting them into NATO, but they came in pretty quickly within the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That whole thing of negotiations and the talks that we don't get to hear and the talks that everybody wants to point out and try to make them look strong and not weak and all that. I mean, obviously you've seen more than your share. It's got to be somewhat of an art form. Then there's timing, what is going down at the time in the world, how this affects,
Absolutely.
you're trying to put out, okay, there's 100 fires today, and we got to put out these top 3 over here. But wait a minute,
Right.
there's another 120 of them breaking out over there, and like, oh, okay, and it's like it's almost beyond comprehension in terms of prioritizing and what by the time that gets trickled down to us, that like what somebody even can like literally explain to put it in terms to educate the masses, and then how
Right.
that
Well,
translates down.
it's interesting, Greg, because people ask me a lot about, how to be a good negotiator. What do you have to learn in school to be a good negotiator? And I always say, well, look, human beings are all negotiators because negotiation is how you get what you want without having to resort to the use of force. So that's the basic negotiation definition that I use. And anybody who has toddlers at home knows you have to negotiate with the toddler about how many stories they're going to get before they go to bed. Or if you got a teenager at home, you have to negotiate about when he's going to bring the car back on Friday night,
Right.
and make sure then he lives up to that commitment. He or she, I should say. So everybody's negotiating every day. You negotiate with your boss, with people at work, with your spouse, with your kids, with your friends if you need something, because essentially we don't want to try to, go around trying to punch people to get what we want. That's normal.
Right.
So I always say it's a natural human skill to be able to negotiate and get what you need without having to resort to the use of force. Now you can hone those skills, and I always like to quote that old Ohio saying: "You get more flies with honey than vinegar." So I tend to, when I'm negotiating, try to look for the points of interest, of common interest, where I can
Right.
like help them to see what their common interest is, and then
Mm-hmm.
bring them along in the negotiation. But sometimes, just like President Trump did, you have to whack them with a threat, with a hard threat, like withdrawing from NATO or stopping our commitment to Article 5 of the NATO treaty. That's the basic, I call it the Three Musketeers article, right? One for all and all for one. If somebody gets attacked in NATO, all the
Right.
other countries will come to its defense.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, by the way, here's an interesting fact about Article 5. The only time that Article 5 was ever invoked was after the 9/11 attacks on Manhattan. And of course, the one plane ended up coming down in Pennsylvania. And of course, we had attacks on the Pentagon as well in Washington. So the Allies stepped forward and came to the United States and said, do you need help with air defense? We can get you air defenses and help with your air defense until we're sure, how many planes are involved,
Right.
who's attacking what. We didn't know if we were going to keep seeing planes coming at us over the next several weeks even. So within a very short time, Article 5 had been invoked, and NATO AWACS planes, the airborne warning and control planes, were flying over the continental United States. So I like to say, here was a time when the NATO allies stepped forward and really helped the United States at a time of severe crisis. So I think
Right.
that's the value of having allies, right? That they're there for you when you need them.
Right.
But to get back to negotiation,
Yeah.
that's
The
my basic point. It's all about, you're going to catch more flies with honey, but sometimes you have to bring out the vinegar, or as we also say, carrots and sticks. You need both.
Okay. So, talking about negotiating, and I believe I want to quote, maybe I'm paraphrasing, but Thomas Friedman had wrote a book that I read that he talked about, in order for the young people of today to really be effective, in whatever profession, they needed to understand the three C's: problem solving, critical thinking, communication, and collaboration. And if you think about, that just lays out, that is negotiation, like you said, right? To be able to articulate a problem, put your head around a concept of like, how can we do this, solve it,
Right.
communicate that strategy,
Yep.
and then figure out how I can get you excited about talking about collaborating and pulling you in, and everybody else obviously contributing portions, so we have this collaboration and we can go forward as one. And I mention this all the time, and I consider myself an educator. I educate people of all ages on fitness, wellness, and their means to an end, addressing issues. And if I can't identify the problem and kind of like communicate what I see, the problem, communicate this is the strategy, which I believe is going to be potentially the easiest pathway for you to consider and integrate. I'll give you an example. When I work with someone, I don't just tell them, you have to eat this, you have to do this, you have to do this. I'm going to say, if you want this to happen, I need you to, it's almost with like dietary. Sometimes it's not what you're eating, it's what you're not eating on a regular basis.
Right.
So taking a look of what's quality going in, just like what kind of information are you taking in? Are you taking in, do you know that's quality information, factual, number one, right? Same. It's got so many, analogies and parameters to go along with life. And I literally try to have them trust themselves. And I just give them these pieces of the puzzle and motivate them to say, oh, wow, I see the strategy you're talking about, and it's relatable. And all they have to do is decide if they really want it. And if they want it, I can't walk you through. You have to.
Has to be their decision.
Exactly. And so sometimes, I just say those three C's because I've created a fitness program, which I'm in talks right now, that I started for young kids, to educate young kids about their bodies, what I call their body temple, and being in tune with their kinetic awareness and their posture and their movement and all that. And then I created for the general population for fitness workouts and stuff. And then it's used for high performance sports people. But also, I'm coming to realize, because I never realized this would be the scenario, but now I'm investigating talks with how that relates to mental health therapy. Because we know the first thing, if somebody is depressed or has high anxiety, they need to move. They need to move get all the exercise. If you have a dog, somebody just told me about the dogs they were watching. The dogs are they have all this high anxiety. They're like, what? They're going, why is this dog so just a basket case? Because it's like a working dog, and you box it in the house, and they don't get enough time on the feet on the ground running it out. That dog's gonna be twisted the rest of his whole life.
Right.
So
absolutely.
So I've done, all my work has been about exercising the brain, and I'm a neuromuscular guy. I'm a detail guy, and this podcast, which is a blessing to me, is a wonderful vehicle that I'm trying to have it purposeful to share people's stories of people who are doing things for our society in all manners, culturally, politics, every realm. And what it's doing is launching me in the spotlight, and I'm meeting more and more people that I believe I'm going to be. My goal, just to let you know, my goal is to create a nonprofit to turn my physical-based program, which can be used for fitness education for children. It can be used for STEM education in children, get them out of their seats and moving, and get those anxious kids that can't sit still. And then a mental health therapy. And I want to be talking to mental health therapists for recovering addictions and all kinds of programs for people to realize, like, this is your body temple. This is your house, and you're going to be only as strong for your family and for yourself if you keep that structure going.
Absolutely.
I'm just
That's really good.
the research has been out since forever, in the 70s, right? So anyway, I want to get back to you. What do you believe is the most important thing when you're attempting to educate someone? Like when you're trying to inform somebody on an issue, or just basically, get a thought across to me, what would you say, what's the best way to, I don't know, inform on a particular issue?
Well, this is a Pentagon cliche, and those of you, and your dad might have known it, people who have been in the military, bottom line up front, right? Bluff. And I always believe that it's
I'm
good
sorry, you say
not to beat
bottom
about the
line?
bush, bottom
Okay,
line up
up
front,
front.
bluff. I always believe it's not good to beat about the bush or to give people too much background, but to say, okay, this is the important point I want to get across. And
Just
then
right at it.
then it can be an interactive thing if they've got questions, or they question you, they say, no, that's not important. I don't see why you'd make that a priority. And then you could have a good conversation about it. But I always find it's good to kind of hit people between the eyes with the bottom line up front, and then talk them through it and try to engage in that way. Sometimes that works. Of course, sometimes you do have to kind of creep up to issues with some
Yes.
finesse. Anybody who's in a regular relationship, has a spouse or whatever, sometimes, like, you got to kind of sneak up a suggestion on your husband. I know that's the case in my household, but
Drop some hints.
generally speaking, I think if you're educating someone and talking to them about something they've really got to know, then it's best to hit them with a point immediately and then talk them through it.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because I just had a conversation. I have many conversations with all my clients, and this is the conversation I have. I talk to them about, like, you've come to me. This is what's important to you. You're trying to, this is your short-term goal. I'm going to try to prep you and support your short-term goal, and I'm going to also have long-term benefits here. And something I go into, I say, so why does people strength train? And they go, I just want to lose weight, or I want to look better. And I go, well, let me tell you something. The reason why strength training is important, we know how it builds confidence. It builds, just a sense of confidence in a physical challenge of taking something in a challenge on, right, and conquering it. And then what I tell people is, like, my most important critical thing for you, as far as I'm concerned, is I want to try to have you structurally make up and understand how your mechanics of all your bones and muscles are operating. Is it keeping you from going out and enjoying yourself and having an active life? If it's gardening or playing, riding your bicycle or swimming or doing some activity you love, vacation, climbing stairs in Europe, that physicality. And ultimately, we want to try to get that structure strong enough to be able to work your heart, which is the most important muscle. Bottom line here, I come in with the zinger, is when you go to the doctor, when your blood work, when you do good, regular cardiovascular exercise, exercising this heart, massaging it, your blood work numbers, all those controllable factors couldn't be controllable. But if you just go out and do something really intense, so that's that sustained, that, when you hear people call it the runner's high, not everybody's designed to be able to just go out and run. Is walking the king? It is the king. But some circumstances, based on their postural makeup, it's like a risk reward thing. So I'm sure you can relate to that in the terms of, like, okay, what can we talk about today? What's the risk reward? How much time do I have? And how interested is this person in how kind of that, I love that bluff. I love it. And putting it up front, and that's my way of softly approaching it, and then going, pow, this is why you're here. And they get excited, right? Because, right, who doesn't want to see their numbers go down? And I've never met anybody that's looking forward to taking another prescription drug.
Absolutely not. Plus, they're expensive, many of them.
Exactly. So, getting back to, your nuclear arms control, which is just itself, like, oh my gosh, try to put your head around that. During President Trump's first term in office, he wanted to achieve a nuclear arms control agreement, I guess, and with Kim Jong-un, leader of North Korea, and then separately with the president of Russia and China, Putin and Xi. Xi? Is that Xi or Xi?
Xi, they say.
Xi. So he wasn't able to succeed. Do you think he'll try this again? I mean, he'll attempt to go down that road?
It's very interesting to me that even when Trump was a real estate developer back in the 80s in New York, he was interested in nuclear arms control. And he approached President George H.W. Bush at that time and said, hey, why don't you put me in charge of the negotiations? I'll get you an arms control deal. He's the man, the great businessman. He likes, prides himself on being able to get good deals. I don't think Bush ever took him up on it at that point in time. But I think for many long years, he's had an aspiration to make some progress in this area, to get control over nuclear weapons that are like this huge threat to humanity, an existential threat to humanity, if God forbid we ever had a big nuclear war. So I do think that that's something he feels personally committed to, and he was keen to make progress during his first term in office. He even said on the campaign trail before our election this week that he really thought it was going to be valuable in his first term to get a deal with both Putin and Xi. They couldn't manage it, couldn't get it done. Kim Jong-un, it was the same. I mean, Trump went out of his way to go and meet up with Kim. That was very unusual. That was a huge step. The American president go meet with the president of the DPRK, the North Korea. So long story short, that's an aspiration from his first term that he wasn't able to reach. So I've got it in my head that that's something he would like to do this second term in office. He hasn't said that. He hasn't stated it as a priority, but I do know he likes the fact that he's been also put forward for the Nobel Peace Prize or the Nobel Prize. And just this last January, one of the Republican congresswomen put him forward again, nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. So, he's definitely proud of that fact that he's been nominated for the prize. And I think, being the good businessman he is, that he knows he's going to have to do something to get that prize. So I won't be surprised personally if he decides to try to negotiate with the Russians, the Chinese, and the North Koreans again, and try to get some nuclear arms control deals done.
I mean, that's a fascinating fact, historical fact that who knew? I mean, I don't think that was ever reported.
I didn't know. I was surprised when I found it out. Yeah.
Wow. So, I mean, do you know anybody who's likely to serve on President Trump's team? And, what do you think about them?
Well, I had the honor of participating in something called the Strategic Posture Commission during 2022 and 2023. This was a congressionally mandated bipartisan committee, 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats on it, and I was on the Democratic side. But I'd like to put the word out there that I think there's a good group of fairly young experts who will be available to work with Mr. Trump should he decide to move forward on this kind of objective of getting some arms control deals done.
And I know we kind of discussed before we started the session here, and I'd love you just to again kind of follow up on that comment. What you're currently, you obviously this first woman ever Secretary Deputy General of NATO, which is amazing. Congratulations on that, and thank you for that service. And curious about, I was asking you, what keeps you busy these days?
Well, I'm at Stanford University now. I'm a lecturer there and a research fellow. So I'm in the academic world now. I'm not serving in government at all. And that I mentioned the Strategic Posture Commission. It was congressionally mandated, but we were all participants from outside of government. There was nobody on it who was full-time government employee. So now I'm really doing some things that are, I hope, going to be helpful for government future policy directions. We have some what we call track 2 negotiations. And even this morning, I was on a Zoom call with some colleagues from Russia on a track 2 basis, sponsored by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And we were talking about some of the possibilities for possible future arms control work, and also involving the Europeans. The Russians have a great deal of interest in what's going on with the nuclear forces in Europe. Both the UK and France have small nuclear arsenals. So we had a big conversation about that today.
I'm curious. I just was thinking about it. Just a thought, question about if you had any opinion on how, because we talk about United States, we talk about Russia, we talk about China now, we talk about even Iran in the mix, the nuclear arms race. That big picture kind of consideration and scenario, how much that plays in, or, when we talk about the whole thing with China and Taiwan and over there in the Straits, am I correct? The Straits, or what's it called that over there? About this, you hear about both Iran and their involvement, if they had what kind of level of nuclear program they have. And I'm kind of mixing that in with the idea of China there on the other side of the whatever you'll call with the Taiwan current situation.
Yeah, well, there are two things we're talking about. One is the possibility of a nuclear crisis and buildup of nuclear weapons. The North Koreans are building up their nuclear forces now. The Chinese are building up their nuclear forces. We're afraid that Iran might get nuclear weapons. They don't have them yet, but we're afraid they're going to build up a capability, and very concerned about that. So there's the whole set of issues around nuclear weapons, because, as I said earlier, they could pose an extinction event for the human race if we ever got into a big nuclear exchange. So they demand a lot of special attention. But when you're talking about conventional threats and crises, like in the Taiwan Straits, it's no secret that China wants to get its hands on Taiwan, and they've said so clearly, and they want to unify, as they consider Taiwan with mainland China as making their country whole. We don't agree with that. We work very closely as partners with the Taiwanese. We're very dependent on the Taiwanese because of the sophisticated chips they make for our computer industry, and super, super important nowadays. So there's a real strong supply chain issue for keeping Taiwan as a close partner, able to trade with us without any problems whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
So we're concerned at the possibility of conventional crisis and conflict involving Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But I think the Chinese, and certainly we would do everything we could to ensure that remained a conventional conflict and did not escalate to nuclear use, because that's not going to be in anybody's interest.
Right. And again, I that was kind of an offshoot question, but I'm fascinated because I'm okay. As much as I can keep my head on top of the news or facts, whatever, it's just kind of it's almost like a continuous negotiation that's going on. And I mean, hopefully, ultimately, all leaders understand, obviously, the fragility of everyone's existence, and everybody's trying to get theirs or have theirs or keep theirs or get theirs back, So welcome to the human condition, right? I want mine.
Welcome to the human condition. If we can keep it from being, I want mine and I'll use a nuclear weapon if I have to get it.
Right.
That's super important from my perspective. That's really what I spent my life trying to prevent, that we don't end up getting into some kind of nuclear conflict.
Well, we're obviously very grateful for that. And I think changing it to a little bit lower level step of intensity, what advice would you give someone who's considering exploring a career in public service?
Well, first and foremost, figure out what interests you because public service is a very, very broad span. I happen to make my life working in the area of nuclear policy and issues around that. Uh, but there's plenty of work to be done on the domestic side as well, trying to make sure people are getting the health care they need, or people are receiving the benefits they need. And so there's a ton of work to be done on the domestic side, or things like ensuring that our educational system is up to quality and we're getting the education to the kids that they need. But there's all aspects on the domestic side of policy as well. So if you're interested in foreign policy, there's so many good programs out there. You can even start in high school to start learning about foreign policy and then decide about doing some more work in college. But then, I always think, and that goes back to my parents once again, saying, you should be working too and getting practical experience. That's why your experience in high school is so much in tune with mine.
Yeah.
Get out there, start to work, start to understand what it's like to be in the world of work and have to work with other people. But
Right.
also then you discover what you like. And there's so many opportunities these days to do internships. For example, the U.S. Department of State has internships for college students. The NATO organization in Brussels at headquarters has internships for college and graduate students. And so, I always say to my own students at Stanford, what do you want to do? Where do you want to work? Do you want to work in Europe? Okay, let's think about NATO. Okay, you are more interested in China and Asia. Let's look at what internship possibilities there are that can get you out there. So it's just really important, I think, to get some experience on the ground, or working with think tanks, for example, that are experts on Asia or Europe or whatever. So you can start to understand: is this what I really like, and do I
Hmm.
want to spend my life doing it? Going
Yeah.
back to our original exchange, though, on sometimes if it doesn't work out, you can change direction in the future.
Right. Right. And I think one of the most wonderful definitions I ever heard about luck or good luck is preparation with opportunity.
Exactly.
And,
And by
and
the way, one of my frequent pieces of advice to students and young people is be ready to take good risks, grasp at good opportunities as they come your way. You got to make sure you do your due diligence so you're not taking a bad risk, but it's worthwhile sometimes to grasp at good opportunities and good risks.
right. The one thing that I also remember back, and I didn't realize this till I'm about 45, is I was thinking back in the days when I was in my 20s. And I had this, or I was like 20, was literally 28. I left advertising. I was all energized. I used to tell, what I used to tell people the first year I started in fitness, I was coming out of advertising. I was hired by a guy who gave me my first job on my enthusiasm alone. My, creden- my credentials were not deep, but he goes, you're going to be my cheerleader. Well, he inspired me so much. Within that first 6 months, I ended up writing a whole program that got recognized, and I got a director position.
There you
And
go. Now that
that was
that was a great mentor for you, right?
exactly. And he's actually on episode 4 of my podcast. And still
Great.
wonderful friend. But the point is that I remember when I just started, and all of a sudden he helped me get certified as a trainer and working with people and stuff. And I'm in this environment, this fantastic environment. And I remember telling people, literally, I said, just watch for me in the funny papers.
That's good.
Because I was determined to lighten up the intensity of this thing that we call fitness and try to make it a approachable, enjoyable type thing. And my dad says, yeah, it's a time to recreate yourself, recreation. And
Right.
so
Absolutely.
that's how, I got, going forward in my old, my career. And again, mentioning the fact that I'm excited about the future because, it's important that one of the primary words I use in my podcast is purpose. And now I've always had a purpose in the health field. And now with this unbelievable need for more even mental health, I'm looking to try to take my program to another level and reach more and more people to try to actually address both education, physical health, and mental health, all in one kind of empowering them in a kind of a physical-based program. That what does it do? It instills problem-solving, critical thinking, communication, and collaboration amongst your peers, and with young people. And there's nothing wrong with too much communication. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And honestly, Greg, I think you set yourself a great objective, and I really thank you for doing that. I'm going to have to wrap up our conversation now because I've got some students waiting for me over at Stanford. But I've really,
Okay.
really enjoyed this
Well,
this morning. It's morning for me, afternoon for you.
right. So again, Rose, thank you so much for spending time with us. It's going to truly be a wonderful episode. I'll be in touch, and we'll get the appropriate show notes and stuff, and we'll go from
Great.
there.
Excellent.
And
Excellent.
this is a must. I'm going
Absolutely.
to have to do a quick shout out to Kathy Payne, Carolyn Froning, and Martha Zimmerly. And because they're going to be excited, that they want to say, make sure let us know when this episode comes out. So Rose,
Yeah, say hi to them for me, cousins.
I will so much. You take care. And again, thank you so much.
You're
Okay?
welcome, Greg.
You take care. All right, guys. Thanks so much. Till next time, kids. Bye-bye.
Professor!